Recovered file RT17B, Department of Transportation Archive Bundle. The file was recovered from a decommissioned records facility outside Millstone County. The first irregularity was not the road itself, but the filing. Two nearly identical boxes sat in separate aisles, each labeled as the complete Route 17B night incident run, and the contents overlapped without matching in sequence. Several pages were stamped received after the office had already been sealed. The anomaly is present in the first complaint. On Route 17B at night, drivers reported passing mile marker 17 again and again while continuing straight. The archive treated the first calls as navigation errors. It did not hold that position for long. A civilian form from a woman named Della Voss is the earliest clean example. She wrote that she had passed the same marker 3 times while driving from the county seat toward North Hollow. She checked her fuel, then her clock, then the dashboard display. All 3 agreed she had been moving for almost 40 minutes. Her last line was, "I do not think I turned around." That sentence appears in 3 copies of the form, but only 1 copy contains her signature. A truck driver's report made the matter harder to dismiss. He called highway assistance because his navigation unit told him to continue straight for 17 miles, then repeated the same instruction after he crossed the same underpass a second time. The dispatcher logged the call as calm. 15 minutes later, the same number called again, with the same voice asking why the mile markers had started over. In the archive, the second call was filed as a separate event. That was enough to break the early assumption of driver error. The complaints clustered in the same stretch of road, always after dark, and always on nights with light traffic. An internal note still tried to preserve a normal frame. It listed sensor drift, misread signage, fatigue, and low visibility. Then a sentence was added beneath it in another hand. Multiple callers referenced the same tree line east of the shoulder. The tree line is never described elsewhere, but after that note it begins appearing in unrelated complaints. One patrol summary is important because it does not rely on civilian testimony. A trooper was dispatched for a disabled sedan and found an empty shoulder, clean pavement, and fresh tire dust in 2 parallel sets where the car should have stopped. The body camera transcription breaks when the trooper says that mile marker 17 was visible ahead, then visible again behind him after he had driven past it. The recovered audio ends with road noise, a pause, and then, very quietly, which one is real? That question sets the shape of the file. There is not yet a crash or a disappearance, only a roadway that refuses to stay in one arrangement and a bureaucracy trying to file that refusal as routine. But one memorandum changes the problem. It orders clerks to stop indexing the reports by date alone and to cross-reference them by mile marker sequence, because events may be repeating before documentation is complete. That line matters because the earliest incidents are not merely similar. They appear to be the same event entered more than once, with minor changes in names, timestamps, and call durations. In one copy, the driver makes it home. In another, The same driver is listed as remaining on Route 17B until after dawn. In both versions, the road is described as having continued forward without change. The packet closes with the maintenance request never processed. It asks for replacement of mile marker 17 after repeated vandalism. Attached is a photograph of the post standing in daylight, cleanly painted and unbroken. Someone wrote on the back in pencil, "Removed on site." The front still shows the number 17. Recovered Fear RT-17B continues in the next packet. This is the first section that cannot be reduced to complaint noise. It contains the first night the route was checked against independent instruments, and the instruments agreed with the drivers until they did not. The anomaly was not just reported, it was measured. The earliest clear confirmation comes from a pair of records dated the same Thursday in late autumn. One is a civilian call form from a woman named Tessa Wren. The other is a speed enforcement summary from a county deputy already on Route 17B when the call came in. Wren reported that her sedan had passed mile marker 17 4 times in less than 20 minutes. The deputy's cruiser camera, described in the summary rather than preserved in full, showed the marker once at first. Then, 14 minutes later, he passed it again without turning around. The summary notes that he did not slow down. That would still have been arguable if the patrol printout had not matched the complaint. The route data shows a steady eastbound track, then a second eastbound track beginning from the same coordinates after a gap of exactly 17 minutes. There is no corresponding turnaround, no interruption, and no recorded exit. A technician later penciled in one line beside the printout. Unit remained in continuous motion. The practical change is that the road started affecting equipment as well as memory. Wren's phone battery fell from half charge to nearly empty, yet the call never disconnected. Her voice stayed calm until the line narrowed to hiss. The deputy's radio, according to his note, began receiving its own transmissions back a few seconds late. He wrote, "Dispatch answers before I finish speaking." That line does not recur elsewhere in the packet, but it is the first sign that sequence itself was being disturbed. A second report from the same night makes the issue harder to contain. A tow operator named Glenn Arp was sent to assist a stalled pickup near the same marker. He found no pickup. He found the shoulder, a shallow drainage ditch, and taillight reflections moving away from him in the dark, though he was alone on the shoulder. Arp's statement is brief. The part that matters is a single sentence. "I saw the truck I was supposed to tow pass me twice without closing distance." He had no explanation. Neither did the officer who signed the call. From there, the records narrow rather than expand. Every credible confirmation points to the same stretch of pavement between the county line and the first service road. In daylight, later maintenance logs show nothing unusual. In darkness, the same road becomes difficult to index. One traffic camera captured a full minute of empty road, then the same minute again with the same headlights at the same point in the frame. The time code advanced normally while the image repeated. Someone in the office drew a box around the discrepancy and wrote, "Playback is not duplicating, seen is." That note marks the beginning of institutional change. The archive no longer treats the phenomenon as confused testimony. It starts treating it as a geographic condition. A regional engineer recommended temporary route closure after sundown, but the recommendation is undercut by a later line added in another hand. Closure does not prevent calls. The margin contains 3 initials, all crossed out. The calls continued anyway. Dispatch logs show a small cluster that share the same problem and the same language. A farm worker said the mile marker was coming back too fast. A nurse driving home from the hospital said her odometer kept increasing while the same woods stayed on her right side. A teenager in a compact car said, "I know where I am. I just keep getting here again." The line was initially filed as fatigue. It became harder to dismiss when the same phrase appeared in another caller's voice 2 nights later. That second occurrence is where the file begins to resist clean chronology. The 2 calls were logged at different times, but the audio comparison note says the background noise was identical down to a passing freight engine heard nowhere on the route. The dispatch supervisor added a clipped comment. Either the caller repeated himself from memory, or we received the same stretch twice. He did not mean that metaphorically. A follow-up check found that the road units assigned to the 2 calls had consumed the same fuel amount and logged the same odometer reading, yet one of them had been parked at the station for most of the hour in question. The first procedural failure appears after that. A barricade was placed before mile marker 17, and traffic was rerouted around the segment. The crew returned before dawn with the barricade intact, but laid flat in the ditch as if it had been set aside after use. The crew chief wrote, "Vehicle tracks go past barrier location both directions without evidence of stopping." Then he added smaller, "Marker still seen." That final phrase changes the case. Removing or blocking the physical reference did not remove the reference from the roadway's behavior. The maintenance photograph taken after the barricade attempt shows the marker post unbolted and hauled away, leaving only disturbed gravel. The night reports that followed still describe the same upright sign at the same distance, lit by passing headlights. Several drivers said they glanced at the empty shoulder and still knew they had crossed 17. One wrote, "I watched the spot where it used to be, and it stayed there." After that, the complaints became more exact. Callers no longer said they had seen a sign. They said they had seen the marker in relation to themselves, as if the road had retained the idea of it. A deputy noted that his passenger side mirror reflected the marker post even while his forward view showed only dark shoulder and tree line. His report is accompanied by a field sketch with the number 17 drawn in the air above the asphalt. The next evening produced the first duplicated vehicle event. It is documented in 3 sources, none of which agree on the full sequence, but all of which place a white utility van on Route 17B at approximately the same time. A citizen caller reported seeing the van pass once, then again from behind, with the same cracked rear window. A patrol log says a trooper heading west saw the same van approach in the eastbound lane, though the road at that point had no median and should not have allowed the sightline. A traffic operator reviewing roadside camera stills identified the same plate number on both passes and then wrote, after a gap of several lines, "It is the same van, and it is not the same one." A later dispatch transcript makes the contradiction worse. The officer asked the driver to pull over. The driver replied that he had already done that twice. The officer asked for the vehicle's location. After a pause, the driver said, "The same road as before." Then the line went dead for 9 seconds and resumed with dispatch asking why the officer had not moved on to the next call. The officer answered, "I am still on this one." By then, the records show a narrower window. The complaints cluster between 11 p.m. and 1 in the morning, with little activity outside that span. No one names the hour precisely, and the archive never gives a clean start time, but one engineer refers to it as the active interval. That phrase is later struck through and replaced with the repetition interval. The road did not affect all drivers. It affected those who stayed on it long enough after dark to cross an unnamed threshold. The file never identifies the threshold. It only shows that it existed. One dispatch tape captures a caller becoming aware of his own repetition in real time. He starts with irritation, then confusion, then a flat, careful tone that suggests he has stopped trusting the road, but still trusts language. He says, "You already told me to keep going." The operator denies it. The caller answers, "No, the same voice told me." The operator asks whether he can see the mile marker. The caller says, "Yes, that is the problem." The transcript stops there, but the summary note says the call did not disconnect. It returned to the queue 3 minutes later under the same number, with the same first sentence. That detail changes the understanding of the duplicates. The calls were not merely copied by the archive. They were being generated again. One clerk wrote across the margin, "Repeat entry is original event. It is the closest thing in the file to a conclusion, and it is not reassuring. The most unsettling item in the packet is a roadside patrol image taken near the end of the shift. It shows the empty lane ahead, the reflective band of the marker post, and the faint outline of another vehicle at the far edge of the beam. The second vehicle is the same model as the patrol car, same roof rack, same missing hubcap on the rear left wheel. The trooper who reviewed the image wrote only one line beneath it, 'I was already there.'" The next packet begins with a route map stamped for internal review. The important change is not the map. It is the first evidence that the roadway had started to fold the record back on itself. Several pages in the dispatch bundle are duplicated with different times, yet the same hand has corrected them all to the same narrow interval. In the margin of one routing sheet, someone wrote, "Night only," always after the second pass. That note is the first place the archive treats repetition as a condition rather than a symptom. The earliest item here is a civilian complaint from a woman who had already called once. Her first report had been filed as confusion. Her second, filed 6 nights later under a different incident number, is more specific. She wrote that she had driven past mile marker 17, then seen it again at the same distance exactly 17 minutes later, and then seen the same abandoned mailbox beside it. The form includes a crude timing note in the corner. 17 minutes, 17 miles. The numbers are not explained. They simply recur often enough that the archive begins to treat them as a rule of the road. A patrol unit sent to shadow traffic confirmed that rule unwillingly. The body camera summary says the first pass of the marker looked normal. The second pass did not differ visually, but the odometer and dash clock showed no corresponding change in distance. The patrol car had traveled for 11 miles when the marker appeared again. The lane lines were continuous and unbroken. The road surface ahead was dry enough to show tire sheen, which should have made a turn in the shoulder visible if any had occurred. There was no turn. The vehicle simply kept arriving at the same place. At that stage, the department still tried to isolate error. The telemetry printout was checked against the dispatch clock, then against the county time server, then against the officer's wristwatch. All three agreed on the hour and minute. None agreed on distance. The GPS unit returned a clean route line that extended past the marker, then snapped back and drew the same segment again. An analyst wrote, "Signal loss not consistent with terrain." Beneath that, another hand added, "Signal loss not consistent with location." The road itself was not changing in the way a broken instrument changes. A maintenance crew inspected the segment during daylight after 2 night complaints from the same driver. They found no cracks, no resurfacing errors, and no sign damage beyond weathering. The pavement was measured, photographed, and marked with chalk. The chalk marks were still there when the crew returned after sunset, but the distances between them no longer matched the field notes. One foreman wrote that the lane was longer by feel than by measurement. That sentence survived repeated copying because nobody knew how to correct it. The 911 transcripts make the next development hard to dismiss. The same voice from the same cell number reported being trapped on Route 17B 3 times in one night. The first call was calm and procedural. The caller gave location, direction, and a description of the mile marker. The second call, 47 minutes later, was from the same number and began with the same words. The third was the same again, except the caller had stopped trying to sound calm. In the margin, a dispatcher noted that the recordings were identical until the caller said, "I can see my tail lights ahead of me." After that, all 3 calls diverged. The duplication was not limited to voices. A wrecker service log shows 2 different operators accepting the same roadside assist request from the same sedan. Both arrived at the designated location. Both found the car empty. The first operator reported the vehicle facing north on the shoulder. The second reported the same vehicle facing south on the shoulder, with the driver door open and the engine still warm. The timestamps were 20 minutes apart. The plate number was the same in both entries, but the color description changed from gray to blue. A maintenance reviewer compared the photographs and found that the car was the same make, though the missing hubcap had shifted sides. That should have triggered a closure on the route, but it did not. Instead, the internal notes show a quiet administrative failure. One supervisor ordered the mile markers in the active segment checked and, if necessary, temporarily removed. The order was followed. The removal log is precise. 3 posts were unbolted from the east shoulder and stored at the maintenance yard before dawn. Yet, the next batch of complaints still referred to visible markers at the same intervals. Some drivers did not describe them as signs. They said they saw the place where the number was, or the shape of 17, even when the roadside had been stripped bare. One caller said the absence was worse than the sign, because the empty spot still made him slow down. A county deputy attempted to verify that report from a moving vehicle and produced the first directly contradictory patrol note in the file. He wrote that the marker was absent when he looked at the shoulder, then visible in the side mirror, then visible again ahead after he had passed the same point. His final sentence reads, "I checked the map before I left. It has not changed, but the road is using a different copy." That is not metaphor in context, it is a field note. By now, the archive had begun to accumulate repetitions that could not be dismissed as clerical overlap. A dispatcher named the same caller 3 times and claimed 3 different officers had answered. A deputy logged 2 separate stops of the same pickup truck within the same hour, each at opposite ends of the same stretch. One incident report notes that the truck's driver was seen waving from inside the cab, then seen again in the same posture 20 minutes later, with no evidence the vehicle had moved. The operator who processed the file underlined the phrase "same stretch" and wrote, "not same stretch, same interval." That is the point where the highway itself becomes the limit of the story. The vehicles are no longer the primary problem. The road is. Every attempt to leave Route 17B from the active segment seems to occur late, or not at all. One trooper tried to cut across a county lane after the second pass and found himself back at mile marker 17 without any corresponding turn in the patrol report. The GPS trace in that unit shows a loop, but the loop is not geographic, it is procedural. The device returned to the same coordinate with slight drift, then corrected itself and drew the route as though no diversion had happened. The officer's written statement is shorter and more telling. "I remember choosing to exit," he wrote. "The car did not." The most disturbing material here is a pair of photographs from the same night, taken an hour apart from different vehicles. The first shows an empty shoulder, a reflector post, and the line of trees beyond. The second shows the same shoulder, the same trees, and a sedan identical to the first photographer's car, sitting where the first image had been empty. The plate is blurred in both, but the bumper sticker is legible. It says in block letters, "Drive safe." The photographer who filed the pair added one note beneath them. "If this is my car, I have not found it yet." That note is where the record starts to fold inward. The following pages are not missing in the usual sense. They are present, but they no longer stay in sequence. A call transcript from 11:23 p.m. is followed by a maintenance order dated the previous week, then by a missing persons bulletin that names a driver who, in an earlier report, had already been listed as returned home. The archive does not resolve the contradiction, it exposes a worse one. The road was not merely repeating vehicles and callers. It was causing the records to repeat them too, with enough variation to prevent anyone from proving which version came first. The last clear item in this packet is a handwritten note clipped to a patrol summary. It reads, "At mile 17 again. There are 2 of us in the lane." The rest of the page is water damaged, but the margin retains a partial second line. "One of them has my radio." That is the final stable description before the file begins to lose its own order. Recovered file RT-17B, continuation packet 3. This portion was extracted after the catalog order had already begun to fail. The anomaly is no longer limited to repeated mile markers or duplicate reports. In this segment, the highway begins to return people to themselves, and the records start recording the wrong version of each return. The first hard confirmation comes from a body camera summary attached to a state patrol stop at 12:14 a.m. The trooper had pulled over a sedan reported as moving too slowly through the active segment. The footage was damaged, but the written summary is intact enough to matter. The trooper approached the driver's side. I spoke to the driver, then stopped mid-sentence because the man inside the sedan was wearing the same uniform insignia as the trooper. Not a similar patch. The same patch, down to a frayed edge on the shoulder seam, that the reviewing supervisor later identified as his own unit issue from the previous winter. The trooper wrote, "He is looking at me as if I am the one who has been stopped." The file's new rule is position rather than duplication. The road does not merely repeat objects, it repeats roles. The same person can appear on both sides of the encounter, and the records will treat the second appearance as ordinary unless someone notices the mismatch. In this case, the mismatch was not subtle. The deputy who reviewed the footage noted that the interior mirror reflection did not match the body camera angle. The driver seen through the windshield was older by roughly a decade than the driver described in the citation form. The citation itself was later filled out twice, both times by different hands, both using the same badge number. The dispatch log deepens the problem. At 12:19 a.m., an operator received a call from the stopped sedan. At 12:21 a.m., another operator received a second call from the same number. Both callers identified themselves as the driver. Both reported that a patrol car had just passed them going the wrong way. The first caller sounded tired and annoyed. The second sounded controlled and asked whether the road had already decided. The phrase appears nowhere else in the file, but it returns later in a maintenance note. The two calls were recorded on separate lines in the dispatch system, yet the audio waveforms in the archive copy are nearly identical for the first 11 seconds. After that, One begins to drift as if the same voice were speaking through two different distances. The dashcam transcript from the same stop adds a detail that does not belong in a transportation file. The driver in the sedan was asked to state his route of travel. He answered, "Northbound to County 8, unless I missed it." The trooper told him he had not missed anything and requested his license. The driver then said, "I have already given that to me." The transcript ends on a pause mark because the audio file was clipped. But the summary sheet notes that the trooper reached into the sedan and withdrew a wallet that contained his own identification card. The photograph of the wallet is poor, yet the name on the card is legible enough to confirm it belonged to the trooper, not the driver. There is no clean explanation for how the wallet changed hands. There is, however, a more troubling pattern. Once officers began reporting duplicated identities, the route produced identical returns at a faster rate. A maintenance truck that entered the segment to assist the stop was later logged, arriving at the yard with 2 sets of keys checked in under the same inventory number. A roadside camera showed the truck departing once. The yard clerk swore it arrived twice, 7 minutes apart, both times with the different driver listed on the paperwork and the same mud pattern on the rear step. The second arrival had no corresponding entry in the travel log, only a handwritten line added to the receiving sheet. Driver says he has already been home. The missing person summaries begin to align here in a way that is difficult to ignore. 5 cases from that season place last known contact within the same 3-hour window on Route 17B. 4 of the 5 names already appeared earlier in unrelated road complaints, though not as missing persons. One was the woman from the first call packet. Another was the tow operator whose truck had been seen twice in a single night. The regional bulletin does not say they vanished on the highway. It says their cases terminate without transition after nighttime travel on the active segment. That is bureaucratic language for a point the record does not want to name. There was no wreck, no witness panic, no roadside struggle. There was only the point at which contact stopped and the route continued. A trooper memo attached to those case summaries shows the first institutional attempt to treat the roadway as a contained event rather than a series of isolated complaints. The memo ordered all marked units to avoid the segment after dark unless responding to a verified emergency. It also noted that the same emergency could not be confirmed from more than one source because callers began repeating themselves before the units arrived. The phrase used was self-generating incident chain. The memo writer crossed that out and wrote, "Do not use chain. It implies an end." The next item is a maintenance record that should have ended the matter and did not. Crews removed the remaining mileposts from the active stretch before dawn. They also painted over 2 reflector faces and checked the shoulder for broken signage. None of it changed the reports. Drivers continue to describe the same reference points, but now they referenced them by absence. One said he knew he had reached the loop because the blank place was where 17 used to be. Another said the road became easier to follow once the markers were gone, because then every empty shoulder looked prepared to become one. That line is in a civilian complaint form and has been underlined 3 times in blue pencil. The removal logs also contain a note that narrows the phenomenon further. The workers noticed fresh tire marks in dust that had been undisturbed since noon. The marks were matched to a county patrol sedan that had not entered the roadway that day. The measurements were exact enough to show the same tread pattern twice, offset by a few inches, as though the vehicle had passed through the same patch of shoulder in 2 slightly different states. The foreman wrote, "No truck left tracks like this. They are one set of tracks seen twice." He initialed the line, then added a second sentence beneath it after a gap in the handwriting. "The second set is cleaner." That note matters because it shows the anomaly had shifted from repeated travel to repeated evidence. The road was no longer only looping vehicles and voices. It was leaving behind records that had been through the loop more than once. A GPS telemetry packet from the same night records a patrol unit moving steadily north for 14 miles, then drifting backward on the map without changing speed, then correcting to northbound again, while the odometer continued to climb. The driver's own statement says he did not notice the map shift until dispatch asked why he had called in from the same coordinate twice. His answer was, "Because I was on the same part of the road twice." He then paused and amended it to, "Because the road was on me." The final audio log from a maintenance vehicle operator is the last material that remains intact enough to matter. It was recorded at 1:07 a.m. on a handheld unit with poor battery retention. He begins by reporting a disabled cruiser near marker 17, though the marker had already been removed. 10 seconds later, he says he can see his own truck ahead on the shoulder with the door open. He does not sound panicked. He sounds careful. He says, "I know what that is. I know that truck. It is me, and it is not me." There is a pause and then a quieter line, likely spoken to someone off microphone. "If I keep driving, I will pass it again." The log continues for another minute, but the useful portion is short. The operator describes passing the same curve, the same utility pole, and then the same truck, now facing the other direction. He does not report collision, stopping, or braking. He only notes that the headlights in the reflection do not belong to him anymore. At the end of the file, he says, "There are 3 of us now if I count right." Then the microphone clicks once and the recording ends without a disconnect tone. That is the most destabilizing fact in the packet. The road had moved beyond duplication into counted multiplication, but only inside the operator's own account. No separate report verifies 3 vehicles. No camera image confirms 3 operators. The archive contains 1 clean photograph from that night, and it shows an empty lane, a removed marker post, and fresh wet tracks entering the shoulder and leaving it in the same place. The tire print is not turned around. It is overlaid. From that point on, the file stops behaving like a sequence of events and starts behaving like a boundary. The missing persons bulletins begin to arrive with the same phrasing, the same dates, and different names. One note says the last confirmed sighting was after the second pass. Another says the subject reported seeing his own headlights. A third, written by a county clerk who had no reason to be dramatic, reads only, "We cannot determine whether departure occurred." That sentence was repeated in 3 separate cases with only the names changed. I do not have any better material than that. The final pages in this packet are water-stained and partially fused together, but they preserve one line in a maintenance hand. It says, "If the road can return us, it can keep us." The sentence is followed by a timestamp and then a smudge where the page was handled too often. The next packet begins after a gap of 11 days, with no explanation for the gap and no assurance that it is real. Recovered file RT17B, final packet. This bundle was catalogued under Transportation Closure Review, though the review never reached a conclusion. The material begins with the same route and the same omission. Route 17B still could not be treated as a road problem once the records showed that the road had started to edit the records themselves. The first page in this packet is a denial memo stamped not for release, then refiled as a missing persons supplement. That change happened inside the archive, not in the field. The later notes no longer describe the route as looping. They describe it as selecting. One internal memorandum from an infrastructure analyst, only 6 lines long, says the active segment did not affect all-night traffic, only vehicles that remained on the highway after what the file calls the second stable pass. The phrase is repeated in later notes with minor variations. One supervisor wrote, "Those who turn early are only delayed. Those who continue are counted." The note was initialed, then crossed out, then initialed again in the same hand. I have not seen another record in which an official used the word counted about drivers and meant it literally. That language matters because the next evidence showed the distinction was not theoretical. A state trooper's body camera summary records a routine stop initiated after a sedan was reported entering the route twice in one night under the same registration. The trooper never reached the driver. He documented the sedan once at the shoulder, then again on the road behind him, then again in front of him, all during the same exchange. The body camera itself did not fail. Its internal clock did. The timestamp advanced normally, but the clip index repeated the same 30 seconds 3 times. The technician added a terse note. "This is not playback error. The footage contains no transition between repetitions." One frame from that review remains important. The trooper is standing beside an open door, looking past the sedan toward the lane. In the next recorded frame, the same trooper is still standing beside the same open door, but the sedan is now on the opposite shoulder, and the first shoulder is empty. There is no cut. There is no interval. There is only relocation without movement. The analyst who reviewed the file wrote, "The camera is honest. The road is not." The missing persons records then begin to align with the active window in a way that ends any useful doubt. There were 6 cases in the span covered by this packet, all from exits near the 17th mile, and all filed as unrelated departures before the routing contradictions were noticed. The names do not matter here as much as the timing. Each case last placed the subject on Route 17B after midnight and before 2 a.m. Each involved a family report of a delay call that repeated with slight changes, and each was later linked to a vehicle or caller already present in another incident file. One bulletin states in plain administrative language that a missing driver was reported alive from a roadside payphone after his vehicle had already been recovered empty at the same mile marker. That call was logged twice by two different dispatchers, and both recordings contained the same line: "I have not left yet." The archive also contains the proof that physical changes to the roadway did not alter the outcome. Maintenance crews removed the last remaining mile markers from the active stretch and replaced the reflective tabs on the guardrail. The following night, two separate drivers described the 17th marker in detail, including the chipped paint on its base and a faint rust stain shaped like a handprint. There was no marker at that location. There had not been one for 4 days. A county deputy drove the segment at dawn, photographed the bare shoulder, and then filed a note saying the missing post was still visible in the rearview mirror after the camera showed nothing behind him. His exact words were, "The road remembers the sign when I do not look at it." The final audio log is where the file stops pretending to be ordinary documentation. It came from a maintenance vehicle operator whose earlier notes had been precise and unemotional. In this recording, he sounds controlled, but the language has changed. He reports passing the same utility pole 3 times, then says he can see his own maintenance truck ahead, with the tailgate down. He does not describe fear. He describes recognition. "I know that truck," he says. "I know the tools in it. I know the coffee cup." After a long pause, he adds, "There is a version of this that got here before me." That sentence is the closest the packet comes to a theory, and it is still only an observation. The most important detail is the one he gives after that. He says he has already called dispatch from the same mile twice, but the answers differed. One dispatcher told him to remain on the shoulder. The second told him there was no shoulder at that location. He then reads back a map reference that was never assigned to Route 17B. The tape captures a rustle, then a quieter line spoken as if he were checking a roadside sign. "If I keep going, I will become the next report." The recording ends shortly after with no crash, no brake, and no indication that he ever stopped the vehicle. There is one last page in the packet, and it should not exist in a closed archive. It is a continuation sheet for an incident number already marked complete. The sheet lists 3 entries under the same date and same mile point. Each entry names a different vehicle, but the same officer signed all 3 as observed in person. Under the 3rd entry, he wrote, "I can no longer tell whether the road is repeating us or whether we are the repeat." The sentence is followed by a correction in red pencil that changes repeat to remainder. That is the surviving record. The file contains no verified resolution, no final patrol closure, and no confirmed recovery of the missing subjects tied to the late-night exits. The route remains classified in the archive as a roadway anomaly, which is too small a label for what the records show, and too large for what they explain. Access to the original packet was restricted after this copy was made, and the sealed facility that held it was later reindexed under a different transportation code with no public notice. I have checked the cross-references. They do not help. The last item I can trust is a maintenance notation written on the back of the continuation sheet. It says, "Do not send anyone who knows the road by heart." That warning was filed as routine. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.